Reducing social anxiety for the scapegoat survivor of narcissistic abuse. Did you find one parent to be consistently hostile towards you? Did your other parents seem indifferent or hard to relate to? Do you find it hard to establish new social connections due to anxiety at being rejected or passed over? A family with a narcissistic parent can take many forms. Sometimes there are two parents where one is narcissistic and the other submissive or detached somehow. Their unfortunate child, who's thrust into the role of scapegoat, faces a no-win situation. The narcissistic parent treats them with contempt and hostility. The other parent, who I'll refer to as the enabler, offers indifference. This dynamic starts with the narcissistic parent's inflated yet fragile self-worth. They feel entitled for others to reflect back their exaggerated importance, and someone else can fail to do this in several ways, from not being deferential enough to possessing an ability or trait the narcissist envies to open criticism. When this happens, the narcissistic parent can feel disproportionately worthless to the offense. They fear these resulting worthless feelings when others do not cooperate with their exaggerated self-importance. And from this fear grows contempt and hostility towards the offenders. A child who is naturally independent, honest, and fair can easily pose such a threat. The narcissistic parent relies on distortions to convince themselves of their inflated self-worth. The child who sees them plainly is then a monkey wrench in this pathological system. The parent can nullify this threat by devaluing, depriving, and trapping the child into the role of scapegoat. And these measures make the child feel worthless, so the narcissistic parent does not have to. The child faces a steady diet of contempt and hostility from this parent. The enabler parent's appeasing or uninvolved attitude gives the narcissistic parent free rein. The scapegoat child cannot appeal for acceptance nor protection from this parent. For reasons I'll discuss later, the enabler parent is unable or unwilling to be there for the child. The legacy for the scapegoat survivor are two beliefs that interfere with their efforts to heal. Healing from narcissistic abuse requires ongoing, safe, and reciprocal relationships. Both of these beliefs set the scapegoat survivor up to expect rejection or dismissal. And this makes the survivor feel very anxious when trying to establish these new safe relationships. In today's video, I explain how the narcissistic parent can envy and then attack the scapegoat child. Then I discuss how the enabler parent's emotional unavailability can make this possible. Third, I'll discuss how the beliefs the scapegoat survivor adopts to survive can later create social anxiety. And watch until the end because I'll offer a tactic you can use today to reframe and challenge this social anxiety. The result can be finding it easier to find and establish the new safe social connections needed to recover from narcissistic abuse. My name is Jay Reed and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in recovery from narcissistic abuse. In my professional and personal experience, I've worked to identify the fundamentals to this process of recovery. And it's led me to what I call the 3 pillars of recovery, which are pillar number 1, making sense of what happened so that you know it wasn't your fault, gaining distance from narcissistic abusers in your life today, and closeness with safe people. And pillar number 3, living in defiance of the narcissist rules. And of course, it's always essential to, at the same time, find and participate in communities of people who can get, validate, and support you on this path. And today's video falls under pillar number 3, living in defiance of the narcissist rules. I've seen and experienced large improvements in quality of life from applying these pillars. And if you want an in-depth guide for how to weave these pillars into your own life, you can check out my recently released book on Amazon. It's called Growing Up as a Scapegoat to a Narcissistic Parent, A Guide to Healing. And for a relatively low cost, you can understand this approach to recovery and see how it has worked in the many case examples throughout the book. And if you are so inclined and you'd like to leave an honest feedback or review at Amazon, that'd also be greatly appreciated. And there's also a more immersive guide to the 3 pillars via my online course called Recovery from Narcissistic Abuse. And I've organized all of these resources for recovery and more on my website. So if you go to jreedtherapy.com, you can get access to free ebooks for survivors and for therapists of survivors. There's a free webinar on self-care after narcissistic abuse, my blog, and a 3-hour course which offers 3 CE credits for master's level therapists who treat survivors of narcissistic abuse. How the family creates a hostile and indifferent world for the scapegoat child. The entitled and hostile narcissistic parent. A narcissistic parent's psychological mission is to stomp out their own experiences of inadequacy. And this proves difficult as they are extremely vulnerable to such states. So instead of taking accountability and looking to mend these feelings themselves, they insist on the opposite. They deny their felt inadequacy and reassert their superiority. Their self-worth is not to be questioned. The person posing the threat is actually the problem. Sometimes it is just the scapegoat child's existence that threatens the narcissistic parent. If the child is born with a sense of decency, goodwill, and honesty, the parent can feel inadequate just in comparison. And this means that the child's mere presence can trigger the parent's envy. The parent loathes themselves for being less than the child in these ways. And they try to solve this self-loathing by tearing down the child who is triggering it. The narcissistic parent uses vindictive attacks to then devalue the scapegoat child. And their logic, I think, is something like, you made me feel bad about who I am by having what I do not have. Now I am going to ruin you and what you have. Of course, the scapegoat child made their parent feel bad through no fault of that child's own. The scapegoat child is left feeling despised just for the mere offense of being alive in this type of family. Well, let's look at another fictionalized case here. We'll call her Violet, who came to therapy in her mid-20s because she felt very alone in her life. She was successful at work, but felt isolated otherwise. She felt a lot of anxiety when she tried to create new relationships or deepen existing ones. She stated in the first session that growing up was hard. She wondered if that had something to do with what life felt like to her now. I, as a therapist, asked, "Can you tell me how it was hard?" She said, "Well, my dad always seemed to have it out for me. I couldn't go a day without him finding some reason to yell at me. The worst part was that he was only mean to me. He treated my younger brother like a prince. He didn't pay much attention to my mother. She pretty much kept to herself anyway." I replied, "That sounds awful and unfair for you. How did you learn to deal with him?" She said, "I just learned to expect his wrath. I knew that nothing I did or said was going to please him. It really sucked. I felt like an outsider in my own family." Violet's presence was one of an articulate, earnest, kind-hearted, and self-possessed person. I began to wonder if these qualities had evoked her father's envy. "How did people outside of your family tend to treat you?" I asked. She said, "Pretty well for the most part. I had friends in elementary school, but as I grew up, I got a lot more anxious with people. I tended to keep to myself in high school and college. I did well in school, and I like learning." "Do you think your father was happy with who he was? Like, did he have friends or find success at work?" I asked. She said, "Well, he always seemed supremely content with himself. He had friends, but they never seemed to last. He didn't talk much about his work, but I do remember him losing his job a couple times. And once I overheard my parents talking, and he had been fired for not finishing his projects. He was in computers, I believe." The picture was becoming clear. I said, "Violet, I suspect that your qualities as a person had an effect on your father that is opposite to most parents. Instead of being proud and happy that you were a smart, self-possessed, kind, and well-liked person, he seemed to feel envious of you. It sounds like his attacks on you may have been attempts to ruin these qualities. And the logic may have been that if you seemed to have or be less, then he would not have to feel so inadequate in comparison. And I wonder if your anxiety today in social situations is in fact a danger signal telling you not to do what used to evoke your father's envious attacks." She asked, "Are you saying my own parent was jealous of me?" And I said, "Well, in so many words. I mean, that's the only explanation that makes sense to me. I'm sure that you did not deserve his contempt for any of the things you were doing. Well, Violet's story shows how a child can become the scapegoat to an envious narcissistic parent. Her social anxiety was not an insecurity about whether others would accept her. It was driven by how her success as a person seemed to worsen her father's contemptuous attacks on her. The accommodating enabler parent. A narcissistic parent may select a partner who accommodates them. And this parent will enable the narcissistic parent's pathology by prioritizing that parent's happiness. And normally this can be a good trait in a healthy relationship. But in a relationship with someone who's narcissistic, this approach can mean that the narcissistic parent deserves everything and everyone else deserves nothing. When all that matters is that the narcissistic parent is happy, then they will have free reign. The enabler parent will offer little to no resistance because this is what makes their partner happy. And I think there can be a couple reasons the enabler parent gives up psychological territory, as it were, to the narcissistic parent. First, this parent might have an unchallenged belief that they are undeserving. So if they grew up with a domineering, perhaps narcissistic parent themselves, then this type of belief may have been necessary to survive. And if their parent has not examined, if this enabler parent has not examined this dynamic that they experienced in their own childhood, they can be much more likely to repeat it. Someone who insists that, say, their domineering parent was the best will see little wrong with how their own narcissistic parent treats them and maybe treats their children. In order to see the narcissistic parent this way, the enabler parent would have to believe that they did not and do not deserve better. Another reason the enabler parent may cede to the narcissistic parent is that they are just emotionally and psychologically withdrawn by nature. Some people find reciprocal social and emotional communication to be difficult, and they have difficulty interpreting social cues, especially nonverbal and emotional cues. And they may find it most comfortable to establish and maintain routines that afford them solitude. This might be referred to in some contexts as neurodiversity, and it's in no way meant to impugn that, but simply to call attention to this healthy neurodivergence and to name how it might impact this person themselves in the context of a relationship with a narcissistic parent, and furthermore their child. So in this particular context, such a parent can fall into the role of enabler, at least when it comes to the impact on the scapegoat child. Since it's so hard to understand and engage with other people, the narcissistic parent may seem impossible to challenge. They may adopt, or the enabler parent may adopt the solution of psychologically withdrawing from the relationship. In essence, let the narcissistic parent act however they insist, while the enabler parent sticks to their own world. Back to Violet's case example, her mother always seemed preoccupied with lists of chores, her exercise regimen, and her job. She worked too as a computer analyst. Violet found it extremely challenging to have a conversation with her mother. Her mother might ask Violet questions about school, but would not have much to say after Violet answered. Violet recalls it always seeming like her mother was trying to find the right thing to say, but just couldn't quite get Violet. Sometimes her mother could start talking about a project at her work and go on for what seemed like hours. And Violet would often feel like she was not in the room when her mother did this. Her mother did not seem to know that Violet would want to feel close to her. She rarely spent time with Violet just for the sake of building their bond. Most of their time together was focused on a task, whether it's going shopping for specific items together, weeding in the garden, and cleaning the house. And silence tended to dominate these activities. Her mother seemed oblivious to how Violet's father treated her. It never occurred to Violet to go to her mother for help with her father. She knew her mother would be overmatched by her father's verbal agility and belligerence. It didn't seem like her mother felt malevolent towards Violet. She just did not seem able to notice at a deep level Violet's feelings. Her mother thrived in solitary, analytical, and goal-directed activities. Social engagement seemed confusing and tended to be avoided. She could cope by tuning the rest of the world out and focusing on what was in front of her. For Violet, this meant going unprotected and feeling like she did not matter to her mother. Impacts on the scapegoat child. Well, there are at least two challenges to having a hostile narcissistic parent and an indifferent enabler parent. First, the scapegoat child has to find a way to keep these parents willing to attach to them, willing to attach to the child. Second, the child has to minimize the emotional pain of how they are being treated. So the child forms beliefs that help them meet these challenges. Younger children, too, are only able to think of the world and others in an egocentric way. So whatever happens is a reflection of the child. A hostile narcissistic parent must be reacting to something in the child. And this way of reasoning can result in a lot of self-blame in this type of situation, but also grants the child a lot of control. If they can change themselves, then they can change the people around them and the world around them. Beliefs to cope with a narcissistic parent's hostility. The scapegoat child concludes it is their attempts to be loved that cause the narcissistic parent's hostility towards them. Finding acceptance and love in life is, of course, an important developmental goal. The child's pursuit of this goal gets associated with the danger of this parent's hostility. And whether the child seeks love from that parent or in other relationships, the envious narcissistic parent will likely grow more hostile. The parent already sees the child as having more than them. If the child feels loved, then this will only intensify the parent's envy and ensuing hostility. The parent's reactions then threaten the child with feeling unattached and intense shame. So the scapegoat child must protect themselves from these threats. They adopt a belief that sacrifices this developmental goal, which also seems to bring on these threats. So the child may land on something like, if I seek love and acceptance, then I will be rejected. Now the child is discouraged from the very behavior that seemed to worsen their parents' hostility. Beliefs to cope with the enabler parent's indifference. The scapegoat child can experience their enabler parent to be emotionally unavailable. The child concludes that the parent's seeming indifference is the child's fault. So the child might be too needy, and that is why the parent seems so withdrawn. Or perhaps the child does not deserve this parent's attention. In either case, the problem is in the child, not the parent. Knowing that you are deserving of reciprocal care and protection is, again, another important developmental goal. The child feels painfully dismissed when trying to get this goal met with the enabler parent. The scapegoat child develops a belief that discourages them from seeking care or protection from the enabler parent. They may determine that I do not deserve to matter to the people who matter to me. Now the enabler parent's indifference is a reflection of the child, not the parent's limitations. Social anxiety in the scapegoat survivor. Well, these two beliefs performed essential functions to survive hostile and indifferent parents. Later, these same beliefs interfere with the experience needed to heal, and that is new relationships with kind and responsive people. Expecting rejection and feeling undeserving of mattering to others naturally creates social anxiety, and this anxiety can make it difficult to find, approach, and participate in these kinds of new relationships. The scapegoat survivor told themselves that others will reject them if they seek connection. And this narrative kept them deprived so that their envious narcissistic parent did not attack them further. Later in life, the survivor may tell themselves other stories that also reinforce this belief, like, I talk too much, I'm not funny enough, I'm not interesting enough, or I'm not attractive enough. And these stories make it difficult to notice the positive receptions from other people today. And the survivor's belief that they do not matter also obviously creates social anxiety. If you're skeptical that you deserve to be important to people who are important to you, then it is hard to feel worthy of others' attention. So even if the survivor does not meet outright rejection, as the other belief would predict, they can still feel inconsequential to others. And this belief creates social anxiety when approaching others because the survivor expects to be reminded that they are unimportant. So back to the case of Violet. In order to keep seeing her hostile father and indifferent mother as viable parents, Violet had to distort her perception of herself. And in her therapy, we came to understand her increased social anxiety in adolescence. She explained that when she left elementary school, she told herself that nobody in the big new middle school would like her. She also assumed that her elementary school friends would not still like her once they were all in middle school. She just would not matter to them. Importantly, her father's rageful verbal attacks seemed to increase at this stage in her life. Her mother remained emotionally withdrawn from her, as sort of per usual. I said to Violet, it sounds like your father got more hostile as you grew up, and your mother offered you little protection or connection. The things you told yourself when leaving elementary school seemed to reflect how you had to cope at home. You expected the kids in middle school to treat you like your parents did. Therefore, you should expect those the kids to reject your efforts to be accepted, and you should not expect to matter to the friends who had mattered to you in elementary school. Violet said, that seems right, but I still think this today in social situations. I'm rarely at ease and think that others find me boring. A powerful tactic to combat social anxiety. The process of recovery for the scapegoat survivor requires new safe relationships. And here's a tactic to cope with the social anxiety that can interfere with this goal. First, the survivor can consider the idea that they are in fact, or as an alternative hypothesis, they are valued and sought after. The survivor's belief that others will reject them is premised on the idea that they have nothing of value to offer. The other person has what the survivor needs, and the survivor can only hope that they receive it. It is likely unfamiliar to consider that the other person, again, if they're safe, may also seek and value the survivor's presence and what they have to offer. The idea that the survivor would be valued contradicts the belief that they would be rejected. And the idea that they would matter to someone else also contradicts their belief that they will not matter to those who matter to them. The survivor also needs to accrue data that the old danger of being attacked, if they find acceptance, will no longer happen. They were conditioned to associate being loved with the narcissistic parent's ensuing hostility. So they learned to associate being important to someone else with grave disappointment. Therefore, the survivor needs to consider this new idea, apply it in life, and get to see or discover that they're not endangered anymore. And back to one more look at Violet. She needed to free herself from the social anxiety that blocked her from new safe relationships in her life today. So we worked to build a shared awareness of how these beliefs were necessary for her prior in life, and we also grew to understand how these beliefs tended to show up in her life today. Well, one day she reported, a guy at work asked me if I wanted to join him and his friends at a party. I like him a lot and suspect he has a good group of friends. But when he asked me, I got really nervous. Like, what would I say to him and his friends there? I'd feel so out of place and they probably wouldn't like me. So I made up an excuse and said I was busy. I told her it was hard to imagine in that moment that he and his friends might welcome you. And she said, yeah, I think it was my past talking to me, but it really felt convincing. The thought of going to the party with him made me so anxious. It seemed like I would be defying some sort of inner law. Well, I think you would have, I told her. In the absence of actual parental presence, you had these beliefs to guide you. They were painful, but they sort of put you in connection with your parents. If you act in defiance of the beliefs by, say, going to the party, then you might also feel like you're doing away with this long ago needed connection. She said, so you think I should go next time? As is always in therapy, I stayed silent. A week later, she came in and she seemed to have a bit of a spring in her step. I said, you seem in good spirits today. Well, she said, I did it. Last Monday, I told this guy that I was really sorry to have missed the party that he had invited me to earlier, and I told him that I would love to hang out with him at another time. And sure enough, he asked if I wanted to go to a bonfire with he and his friends this past weekend. I was so nervous, but I said yes. The rest of the week, I'd get those anxious thoughts, but I was still determined to go. I told her, you demonstrated a lot of grit. She said, I guess so. When I actually went, it was not at all like I expected. People seemed genuinely interested in me and what I had to say. I hit it off with this one woman and we exchanged phone numbers. I think we're going to play tennis this week. I asked her, how has this left you feeling? Well, I was a little nervous the day after the party, like some other shoe might drop. It was strange. But as the day wore on, I thought about our session coming up today, and that seemed to help. Violet used her experience in therapy, where she was welcomed and I think felt important, to defy her constrictive beliefs. She wanted to make new fulfilling connections in her life. Declining this man's invitation interfered with that goal. And she defied the messages her beliefs were sending and accepted his next invite. Importantly, she then reflected on her lingering feeling that something might go wrong afterwards, just as her finding acceptance used to result in her father's increased hostility. And she took in the fact that nothing bad happened this time. Well, that's meant to illustrate how this tactic can be put into practice, and this is in the therapeutic realm. I hope you enjoyed today's video or found it useful, and I want to thank everyone for your continued support of this channel, all the resources that surround it, I can't tell you how much it means to me that you found some of these things useful in your own process of recovery. As I always say, the connections that are offered one another in the comment section. That's kind of like the connection section too at times. And with that, I wish everyone well, and I look forward to posting again next week, next Friday. Take care.